This is the second segment in our discussion of radio and its promises, and we will talk about radio stations early on as well as early ideas for financing radio. As you know, there was no master plan for what to do with radio, and several entities were vying for it, for control of it. The Navy, amateur broadcasters just wanted to see how it worked. These were people who were interested in tinkering around. In addition, we had corporations like the Radio Corporation of America who were vying for control of the new medium. Well, while all this vying was going on, people like Frank Conrad, who was a Westinghouse engineer, simply started broadcasting from their garages and places that were convenient for them, kind of tinkering around and experimenting. So Conrad broadcast in 1920 from his garage and asked people just to call him if they could hear him. Well, they did, and one thing led to another, and pretty soon he was taking requests for specific records. Now, Vice President at Westinghouse saw that, boy, if they owned their own radio station, they could create a market to sell receivers, which is the part of the Radio Corporation of America that they had been given. So they got a license, and from the shack on top of the Westinghouse plant, the results of the Cox-Harding election were broadcast on KDKA on November 20th, 1920. All the way on the other coast, Doc Harold had begun broadcasting in San Jose, California, all the way back in 1909, so 11 years before. From about 1912 to 1917, just working from his lab, he broadcast music, news, and talk on station KQW. His wife was probably the first female broadcaster, and she had a show that was broadcast from a store right next to her husband's lab, and it was a program for young people where she also took requests. Well, corporations were not about to stay out on the outside and watch this all happen, so RCA brought British Marconi. And David Sarnoff, you remember David Sarnoff, was appointed a commercial manager and immediately started to bring about his radio music box idea. Sarnoff made radio an overnight success by broadcasting the heavyweight championship between Jack Dempsey and George Charpentier from Jersey City, New Jersey. Over 300,000 people heard it, and radio was off and running. It became a national craze. Well, as I said, we had these different competing interests. We had corporate interests who wanted private control for profit. We had the Navy who wanted it for radio for official purposes during war. And then amateur operators. They were the ones who saw the airwaves as belonging to citizens so that they could communicate with each other. Out of all this, though, there was no real plan for who was going to pay for the programming, for example. So many feared the idea of commercial radio. Herbert Hoover, who later became president, said, "It is inconceivable that we should allow so great a possibility to be drowned in advertising chatter." So at first, station owners covered the cost, but it was too expensive. So a magazine called Radio Broadcast ran a contest for a prize of $500 for anyone who came up with the best idea for funding radio. And so some ideas that were submitted were a tax on radio receivers and tubes that would be paid when they were purchased, city or state taxes, the development of a common fund that would receive contributions and then distribute it to stations. And then finally, some people thought that wealthy people, philanthropists, ought to fund it. This was not such a crazy idea because, after all, that's how libraries had been funded. So while all this was going on, AT&T in 1922 proposed a national radio network supported by advertising. They called it toll advertising. And they said that they would provide facilities but no programming. So anybody who wanted to broadcast could come and use their facilities and their station and pay a fee. Now, AT&T didn't think that the public would accept advertising that interrupted the programming, so they proposed a sponsorship as a means of programming, meaning that Eveready, for the first sponsored radio program, the Eveready Hour, meant that this was a practice that continued for the next 30 years or so. So the Eveready Hour, sponsoring radio programming, took to the air in 1924.